For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Professor Simon Roberts joins me to discuss a book he co-authored titled Competition Law and Economic Regulation. Welcome, Professor. You recently co-edited a book about competition law and economic regulation. What is your understanding of the role of such policy frameworks, and why is it necessary to regulate market power in a modern capitalist economy?
Thank you very much. So the book, which I edited together with Jonathan Claren and Imran Valodia, draws together work that explores the issues about why competition and regulation matters. Essentially, the contributions to the book show that markets only work both for consumers and also for producers if there is competition. And what does that mean? That means that you have enough participants in the market so that consumers have got people to choose from, that no one supplier has got the power over consumers. If you have a monopoly, it means that consumers have got no choice. There's another important aspect of it, though, I think, which is very important in South Africa and also other African countries, which is that you need the ability for people to come into that market as producers. So if a market has got barriers to entry, it's closed off from rivals, from entrepreneurs, then it also doesn't work for the economy. It means that the firms that you've got are the firms that you always had, and the ones that may be bringing new products or better products to the market, or they're investing, they're creating jobs, they can't get into the market. So a competitive market really matters both for consumers, but also very much for producers.
The book also states that the enforcement of competition regulations in our neighboring countries has not been as effective as it is in our country, South Africa. Why is that the case?
So I think, first of all, it's useful just to also use the South African experience. I think South Africa built institutions, and it takes quite a long time to do that. So it's an investment in that institution building process. And in neighboring countries, other countries in SADC, the institutions are quite young. So they're doing well in some countries, such as Zambia, Botswana, Namibia, but it takes time for them to build up. The other thing, I think, is that you need political support. And I think that's an important part of the book, is to explain and to research why competition matters, so that the higher level of awareness would mean those institutions get more support from citizens in their country, from political parties, and that will mean that they'll grow over time and will have a better market economy.
You also state that while high penalties may be required, it is difficult to impose them too early in the life of a young competition regime. Why do you hold this view?
So this is a very interesting question, because the penalties are generally for collusion. And that's where firms get together and they raise the prices to rip off consumers. So you need to have high penalties, otherwise you won't deter the firms from doing it. So on one side, you need very high penalties. But when you start imposing these penalties, the courts say, but this is a very, very high penalty, and we don't see, we don't see a theft here, we don't see a robbery here. We see firms getting together, and yes, they've raised prices, but is it that bad? So you have to build up an understanding as to why the harm to the economy is so large. And as you build that understanding up, then the judges and the courts realize that you actually have to have very substantial penalties. Otherwise, the firms won't stop doing it. And in our case, I'm not sure the penalties are high enough yet, because we keep on seeing the Competition Commission finding more cartels. And that suggests that the firms are not yet worried enough about the rules because they're still breaking the rules.
In South Africa, cartel behavior is prohibited by Section 4(1)(b) of the Act. The penalty for participation in a cartel is a fine of up to 10% of the firm's annual turnover. The firm also faces the risk of damages, claims by customers who may have suffered harm as a result of the cartel activity. Moving along to the next question, you also emphasized the importance of the competition authorities, that they should always remain impartial, independent, as well as open-minded when they handle cases. Why is such professional impartiality important?
I think it's important because competition cases involve large amounts of money. Very powerful corporations are involved in those cases. So in cartel cases, those companies have got together to raise the prices. But in abuse of dominance cases or monopoly conduct cases, you're talking about a single large firm which has been able to control the market in some way and eliminate or cut out some of its rivals. So these firms have got a lot at stake. So if you don't have impartial competition institutions, then they're at risk of being influenced by these companies. There's also other interests that might come into play in terms of the policy framework. But competition law is fundamentally about regulating the business of private commercial entities, which, as I said, may have a lot of power and lobbying ability. So it's very important that you have an independent competition regime.
So tell me, who should be reading this book?
So this book is really for a research community, but also hopefully it's accessible in terms of the case studies to a wide audience that's interested in how the economy works, how the economy functions. We've got case studies in there of how different sectors work across the region. So it's not just focused only on South Africa. We've got case studies on Zambia, Zimbabwe, etc. So we've got case studies about how this works, and so we think there should be a broad interest in these questions.
How important is it to look at cartel conduct now across the SADC countries?
So one of the things that has come out of the South African cases, each cartel case or each competition case is like a window into a world. And one of the things that has come out of this window into the world is that companies don't operate within one country. It's pretty obvious in a sense that a company doesn't say, I'm operating in South Africa, and they stop at the border compared to, say, Gaborone or Mazero Mbabane. So the same companies are operating across Southern Africa and even further afield. So if they're colluding, for example, and we saw this in the cement cartel case, then they're likely doing this on a regional basis. So the cement cartel allocated markets across the region. So they allocated Botswana to one company, for example. So they allocated Botswana to one company, Lesotho to another company. Now each country may not see the extent of the conduct. So it's very, very important that the authorities cooperate, which is what they're starting to do, in order to be able to look at a wider regional market. And this is very important, as regional integration is a big part of building competitive capabilities, of investing in production, growing the economies. It's not just about South Africa. We must really look at it at a regional level.
Another interesting case, we received a statement yesterday where 11 furniture removal companies and the movers associations which they belong to, they face prosecution in the tribunal for fixing prices involving the e-toll levy they charge customers who transport belongings on the Gauteng highways. So the last question that I would like to ask do you think our government is doing enough now to educate companies about competition law as well as economic regulation?
So I think South Africa is seen around the world as a case study of a very successful growing competition regime. So I think there's been a lot of publicity about the competition law. I think there is growing awareness in companies about it and what it means and why it's important. So of course each company, if they're charged with conduct, will be very unhappy. But of course they're also buying products as inputs. So I think it's about a system that we all buy into and realize that it works well together. So I think the fact that there's been a lot of cases shows that you've got effective institutions. I think the question is, how much do we buy into this going forwards? And in particular, this issue about how do we open up the markets to wider participation. So this would relate to the Black Industrialist Program, for example, of the government. And I think that is where the boundary is now, if we're going to push it out, is to say these markets must be fair and will all benefit if there's more investment coming in. Even the firm that has been in that market for a very long time will do better if it's pushed by a rival, because they'll have to improve and upgrade their products, their service, their delivery. Ultimately, that will make them more competitive, and that will benefit all of us. So I think this is where the government is pushing, but there's a lot more work to be done.
So for interest's sake, my last question would be do you think maybe small companies should be charged the same to compare to the companies like the PPC cement companies, or should be a difference?
So that's an interesting and a very important question. Generally, the fines are worked out as a percentage of turnover. So there's a methodology, which means the fine is proportionate to the size of the company. So that, in a way, takes that into account. But also, small companies would tend not to be involved in the conduct, because the conduct normally involves companies who've got market power. And you don't have market power if you're very small, unless as a small company you got together with lots of other companies to collude. And then you should really watch out, because you may have been brought into that conduct by the larger companies, but it's still your own responsibility as to whether you're getting into that conduct or not, and agreeing with the larger companies about charging higher prices. And then, smaller companies, I think they should be aware, and so they have to take responsibility ultimately for what's happening.
Thank you very much, Simon, for your time.
Thank you, Sunny.
That was Professor Simon Roberts speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about the book titled Competition Law and Economic Regulation.